So the courts have been quite careful about transformational constitutions. And you, government, your democratic government, signed these international treaties. This is what Section 7.2 of the Bill of Rights says. We can't ignore them. And the Treatment Action Campaign was not a sermon, but it was also a lecture to President Mbeki and to the country on the science of AIDS. And the consequent order is a gross mischaracterization of what the Constitution wants, and it's a gross injustice, but it's also a gross danger.
Justice Cameron, thank you so much for making the time to talk to me about 3 decades of democracy in South Africa. At the African Law Matters blog, we are reflecting on the Constitution and the judiciary after 30 years of democracy, and we are honoured to have an opportunity to hear some of your thoughts on this, especially in the light of your role and many contributions to the South African legal landscape as a legal practitioner, academic, judge, and of course, as a judge of the highest court of our country. So if I may begin right there, Judge, am I correct in saying that your judicial career began also 30 years ago when you were appointed by President Mandela as an acting judge of the High Court?
Very much so. And what a joy to be here on African Law Matters and to be interviewed by you, Lauren. It's a great pleasure and a significant year for all of us as lawyers who are concerned about good governance and social justice. So I'm very happy to be doing this. And yes, my first judicial appointment was as an acting judge, which went through in August 1994 at the behest of the Justice Minister, the first Justice Minister on democracy, Abdallah Omar, and signed by President Mandela. So 30 years later, here we are.
Oh, wonderful. What a fascinating and challenging time to become a judge. So with that in mind, I'm very interested in your views of the Constitution, which, as you would be very well aware, was created as the supreme protector of democracy and human rights. So after 30 years of democracy, I'm very interested in your views on the ways in which the Constitution has succeeded and failed at achieving that purpose and the challenges that it has faced along the way.
I think the first thing to say, and perhaps the most important thing to say, is that the Constitution creates a framework for how power should be exercised. It doesn't exercise power itself. Power is exercised by other actors in the democratic sphere. So I think there have been successes and failures. The failures have been grievous. They are grievous failures through lack of governmental capacity, lack of governmental determination, the failures in directing, sustaining practical government outputs to realize the Constitution. There have been some failures by the Constitutional Court as well, in the areas of sex work, in the areas of dacha, which was remedied by the splendid judgment of 2019 by then Deputy Chief Justice Zondo, which in effect remedied what had gone wrong in the Prince judgment in the early 2000s. But there have also been successes. I think the successes lie at various levels. The one is simply the consciousness, a widely disseminated public and politically elite consciousness of the Constitution and its values, which have given rise to legal and practical and political implementation. I would also say that the Constitution has changed our sense of ourselves as South Africans, not just within the urban elites or within the legal practitioner circle, but also amongst young people in rural areas. I think often of young queer people who are coming to terms with their same-sex sexual orientation, and they have a sense of their constitutional citizenship and equality. And then, of course, there have been enormously important decisions on land, on housing, on powers of parliament, on what government must do, on international law. There have been decisions curbing and molding the exercise of power by the other arms of government. So a mixed bag, and overall, I would say, not a star-studded report at all, not a golden report, but one that would qualify for some encouragement and affirmation.
Thank you, Judge. I think that's a very balanced and well-reasoned answer to a very complicated question. So thank you. As you say, the Constitution creates a framework, and you obviously alluded, or you spoke about the Constitutional Court and the judgments that they have handed down using the Constitution as the framework. So while you've already spoken about several judgments which have played a really important role in the last 30 years, I just wondered if, in your view, there are any other or any particular landmark cases or decisions that you think have been particularly influential in shaping democracy and the trajectory of human rights in South Africa?
I would mention three starring decisions, the leading role decisions, then I would add a few to those. And the starring decisions, I think, the two most prominent are the Treatment Action Campaign decision of July 2002, and then the Nkandla decision by Chief Justice Mogoeng on the 31st of March 2016. Those decisions were both important. The latter one on Nkandla in determining presidential subjection to the rule of law and Parliament's subjection to the rule of law. And of course, what the Chief Justice there did was that he gave a lecture on civic duty. And I think he enjoyed, I told him it was a sermon, and he rather enjoyed my saying that, and he has gone on to repeat what I called it. And the Treatment Action Campaign was not a sermon, but it was also a lecture to President Mbeki and to the country on the science of AIDS. And the consequent order was the basis for the rollout of antiretrovirals. I'm one of 7 million people now in our country who are on antiretrovirals, almost all of them publicly provided, and that's a consequence of that decision. The third starring decision I would mention is the one in which Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke and I wrote together, the Glenister decision. And then I would tag on quite a few ones where the court, for example, ventured into the applicability outside South Africa of our international law provisions, where President Zuma's connivance, I think, rather dejected, if not disgraceful connivance in the abolition of the SADC tribunal was set aside by the court. And also the Zimbabwe farmers' claims for redress, which were recognized by the court. And the last two I would mention, which I think are of great importance, are the court's refusal to allow government to extend minimum sentences to children under 18. And then my beloved colleague, Justice Sisi Kampepe's decision on refusing to allow the criminalization of young adolescents who engaged in sexual play of some sort. So over a wide range, there have been landmark decisions that have, in very disparate areas, anchored the rule of law, anchored the public consciousness of the values and the aspirations of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights particularly.
Thank you for that, Judge. And I can say that as a law student studying throughout some of those cases while they were happening, but also some that happened before, we actually studied many of those as very important landmark cases in the development of those particular rights. So I can confirm that they were really, really important from many different aspects, including an academic one. So thank you for that. I think a related question to this, since we've spoken about the Treatment Action Campaign case, is that throughout your career, you have been known for championing LGBTQ+ rights, and you've also been described as a world-renowned HIV/AIDS activist, as well as a health rights activist. So I wondered if you could comment on how these rights in particular have developed in South Africa over the last 30 years.
Definitely. I didn't include the LGBTIQ decisions of the court, which were 4 or 5 very powerful decisions, which culminated in the court requiring Parliament within 1 year to create equality of marriage for same-sex couples. I didn't include them because they, I think, are emblematic of a wider commitment by the court to equality, to dignity within the Bill of Rights. So they form part of that greater cadre. But the fact that in Africa, queerness is still so highly stigmatized do really earn those decisions amongst the landmark decisions of the court in saying we will prioritize dignity, we will prioritize equality. Relatedly, the Treatment Action Campaign decision, which you mentioned, did the same. because of the high stigma that disables effective public management of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And of course, what the queer decisions have done is to make people like me enjoy in our minds and in our agency full democratic citizenship. What the HIV decision, the Levirapine, the famous treatment action campaign decision did was to force government to start making ARVs available. And as I said a moment or two ago, we do have the world's largest publicly provided treatment provision program. It's a public-private partnership because many private actors also assist in the distribution of ARVs, but a great triumph not just for government, but for activists. The treatment action campaign forced the courts to engage with this issue, but also for people living with AIDS or with HIV, where, as I've said, 7 million of us are now on a simple daily regimen of antiretroviral treatment that is keeping me alive, keeping us alive.
Oh, thank you for that, Judge. I think that's very inspiring that the Constitution and that our democracy has developed along with those rights. Following on from that, I wondered if you had any thoughts or insights on perhaps what we could be doing to strengthen those rights and enable more people to realize them in the future.
It's a very good question. Belatedly, Parliament has enacted hate crimes legislation for a variety of vulnerable groups, including queer people, who are targeted in hate crimes. I think that was necessary. There's been some debate about the desirability of hate crimes legislation. I think the arguments in favor are conclusive, not only for what they do, which is enhanced penal capacity on the courts for those committing hate crimes, but also for what they say, because the law is emblematic, and that's why it's so important to reform the law with regard to dacha, other drug uses, and with sex work, where the court has not yet remedied its failure in the early 2000s to strike down the criminal prohibitions on sex work. So more can be done, but I want to mention something rather more difficult, which is not directly legally related with both HIV and with queerness, with LGBTIQs, same-sex orientation or gender identity. I think that greater public visibility would be enormously helpful. The stigma of HIV and AIDS is largely externally enacted, and it's largely external in origin, but much of it takes place within one's own mind. The internalized stigma, the same as with queerness, to some extent even, as Steve Biko had it, with racial consciousness. There are internal oppressions, as he called them, affecting Black people. And we have to deal with those internal dimensions of externally created and enacted stigma, ostracism, and discrimination. And I think there, it's a difficult issue, but I think a lot more can be done to realize the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, thank you, Judge. As you say, it's a real challenge, but let's hope that we have the framework and the tools from the last 30 years to build on that. Moving on then, you have already spoken about the regulation of public power and that aspect of the Constitution's work and how it provides for checks and controls of public power. So the Constitutional Court has handed down various landmark decisions, some of which you have already mentioned, which have focused on the control of public power. So while we're discussing those and the benefits of those judgments, I think another important aspect to consider and discuss is how the Constitutional Court navigates the delicate balance between respecting the separation of powers and holding government institutions to account, while also ensuring that they respect the separation of powers doctrine. So, yeah, I just wondered if you had some thoughts on how they strike that balance.
I would say from my nearly 11 years on the Constitutional Court that the primary way in which that delicate area is negotiated by the court is through care, through humility, and through great consciousness of the powers vested in the court. So the court doesn't have an arrogant sense that we're going to call the shots here, we're the highest court in the land, I always used to flinch when my colleagues said we're the highest courts in the land, but that sense of apex power didn't permeate our discussions. There was great care taken. And I will instance one of my own judgments, the very last one that I delivered from the Constitutional Court bench. I gave other judgments after I'd left, but this was the one that was delivered on the morning that I left the court, which was the Mulase judgment, which concerned land tenure. What had happened was that a beautiful Mandela era statute afforded land tenants, people on other people's farms, and there the racial dimensions were obvious. Most of the land tenants, almost all were black, and almost all the landowners were white. But that statute gave the land tenants the power to claim the land on which they lived, the land on which their cattle and other livestock grazed, and the land on which they sowed their crops. It could have wrought a revolution in South Africa's land tenure, but nothing was done. For 20 years, there was a complete failure, meshed in corruption, ineptitude, diversion of energies and attentions. And the court upheld a decision of the Land Claims Court, appointing a special master. There was a case to be made, and the case was made before the court, for the court itself to supervise the implementation of the rectification of the catastrophe of the Land Tenure Act. But the court said, no, we'll give it to a special master. The special master can come back to the court. So I instance that as an example of the care with which the court tried to strike a balance. I would say one more thing in answer to that important question, which is that doubts about the court, how it exercises that, are a source of legitimate debate, an area of very important debate, but often the doubts are expressed by people acting in bad faith. We had President Zuma during his tenure, shortly before his tenure in 2009, saying that judges aren't gods. We had Minister Mantu Chabalala Msimang saying that sometimes the court must listen to government on HIV and AIDS. And I think we still have that phenomenon of people with no good intentions, people who are invested in looting and corruption and criminality, casting doubt on what the court is doing. Obviously not all of them, because some of them raise important issues for debate, but often bad faith actors.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and really important point, Judge. And I think it leads very nicely to another question that I wanted to ask, which is that in recent years, the Constitutional Court has been increasingly called upon to deal with high-profile, politically loaded cases, where this issue obviously becomes all the more fraught. So I just wondered what your views are on the implications of this phenomenon and trend for South Africa's democracy and the role that the court plays in that.
It's also a very, very interesting question with very much debatable answers. But I think the first point to make is the breadth of the Constitution. This is a Constitution which acknowledged the ability of conscientious, principled judges to do good, but also acknowledged the dangers of giving the judiciary too much power or Parliament too much power, giving each of the agencies of the state too much power. So the breadth of expression in the Constitution requires the judiciary, which is itself subject to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, to do many things. So that's the first point I would make on politically loaded cases, is that the Constitution, what do you do when you get a case that requires you to exercise powers in a politically fraught atmosphere, where nevertheless the power is entrusted to you to determine how to apply it and what its ambit is? The second point I'd make is that the courts have generally they've embraced and hugged the text of the Constitution. They haven't sought to range beyond it. If you look at Glenister, what it did was to meld international law, to domesticate international law, but to say, you government, your democratic government signed these international treaties. This is what Section 7.2 of the Bill of Rights says. We can't ignore them. So that's hugging and embracing the text. The last 2 points I'd make is that court bashing, I think, is often misplaced. Again, it's the bad faith actors, the losers. And the phenomenon we have is that when people want to invoke the courts and claim rights in the Bill of Rights, they go to the courts, but when it doesn't suit them, those same actors, including in some political parties like the EFF, and I expect the same will happen with former President Zuma's party, the MK party, when it's politically convenient for them to disrespect and to dishonor the courts, they will do so. And I think we have to be aware of that while also acknowledging that the Constitutional Court and the courts are legitimate political targets, but we have to be very savvy about understanding the motives of the people who are criticizing what they do.
I'd like to move on then to another fundamental objective of the Constitution and our democracy over the last 30 years, which is transformation. So former Chief Justice Pius Lange advocated for transformative constitutionalism. So in your view, what are the main obstacles confronting constitutionalism and transformation in our nation?
I would say that the major obstacle is governmental lassitude, inefficiency, corruption, dysfunction, lack of energy, lack of determination. I think that goes back to our conversation for the last 20, 25 minutes, which is that the Constitution was not self-executing. It was a framework for the exercise of power. It enabled agents and actors to invoke its provisions, but they had to be invoked and they had to be fulfilled. So I would say that government inefficiency has been the major problem in giving effect to the Bill of Rights. But I want to make one more point. If one goes back to the article which by Carl Clare, which really introduced this notion of transformative constitutionalism as a contradistinction to the United States form of constitution, where the Constitution is a limit on governmental power and has been expressed by that by Supreme Court judges. It's a charter of what government should not be doing. We're the opposite. We have a Constitution that says what government should be doing and must do. So I think that the basic argument that Professor Clare made was very persuasive. The courts have been quite conservative. They haven't, like in India, said, we can walk out on the streets and find homeless people on the pavements, call them in and give an order against government, that government must house them. So the courts have been quite careful about transformational constitutionalism, but that is at the background of what Chief Justice Lange so insightfully said, and it's something that we should bear in mind on the 30th anniversary of our democracy.
Thank you, Judge. These have been some really fascinating thoughts, so thank you for sharing them. Now, I think we've reflected a lot on the last 30 years, but I also think it's important for us to look to the future. So with that in mind, what do you believe is the biggest threat to the future of South Africa's democracy?
I gave a speech recently, about 6 weeks ago, in accepting the Kentridge Award from the General Counsel of the Bar.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you so much. The point is simply to alert the viewer that I'm quoting myself, which I do with diffidence. But they identified two threats. The first is poverty and inequality. And I urge lawyers to do much, much more. I urge myself to do much, much more, to offer legal services, offer legal advice. And I gave various ways in which lawyers could combat inequality. I set out practical ways, including personal wealth sharing, support to legal organizations, not just the minimum of the LSA and GCB required pro bono work. So I think that poverty and inequality, we run the risk of creating an elite and a super elite society well served by lawyers, well served by legal rhetoric, well served by constitutional aspirations, from which 40, 50 or 60% of our population is in effect excluded. That's a gross mischaracterization of what the Constitution wants, and it's a gross injustice, but it's also a gross danger. I think that's one of the two dangers. And the second is a lawyer-operated danger. It's the risk of cynical, bullying, lying, manipulative, dishonest lawyers. And unfortunately, there are members of the bar, prominent members of the bar, well-known lawyers who fit that description. And those lawyers are employing dishonest tactics which imperil the rule of law and the Constitution. What they do is to protect their clients, who are sometimes commercial actors and often politically prominent people, from facing the consequences of their misconduct and having a fair trial about that misconduct, but never getting to the point where there's a reckoning. It's obviously called the Stalingrad tactic. It started with Mr. Zuma when his counsel was Mr. Ken SC, now sadly deceased, but it continues today and it continues across a range. Now, that sounds cataclysmic, but the courts have the power in their hands. The legal bodies, the legal regulatory bodies like the Legal Practice Council, the GCB itself, but most importantly, the courts. They can say, you will not have another postman. You will not protract this argument. We will not allow you to conduct your case in a way that brings the law itself and the Constitution itself and the rule of law itself into disrepute. And that is a power that lies with legal practice and the courts. And I hope that that power will be exercised.
Oh, thank you, Judge. That's really interesting. As you say, the law is blunt and unwieldy in many ways. And I think I agree completely. Access is so important, as well as effective use and acceptable use. Considering global trends and contemporary debates surrounding constitutionalism and democracy, what lessons can be drawn from South Africa's experience over the past 30 years? And what implications do these lessons have for the future of democracy in the country and beyond?
I think there are great perils. We have illiberal populism in countries like Hungary, Turkey, and elsewhere, where a populist-based claim to power is perpetrated in an illiberal way. We have illiberal authoritarianism on our continent. President Paul Kagame in Rwanda, and people say that the streets of Kigali are clean. Well, they're clean, but at what a cost? So I would say that the Constitution and the rule of law are vulnerable because of government dysfunction, because of inequality and poverty. And we must be careful, because the very actors who are undermining the rule of law through the Stalingrad tactics are doing so in order to enable corruption, looting, criminality, criminal syndicates to take over from the rule of law. So I think that we are at real danger. We have to be alert to it, and we have to respond constructively to it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for all of those thoughts, Judge. If I might, at the end of this discussion, ask a slightly more personal question. Looking back to the beginning of South Africa's democracy in 1994, when you were made a judge, I suppose, at the same time, the drafting of the Constitution and the creation of the Constitutional Court, would you ever have imagined that one day you might become a justice of the Constitutional Court?
I did imagine it. And of course, I was urged by comrades and fellows in the legal public service field to apply, and also my career comrades. At that point, I hadn't spoken publicly about living with HIV, but many people in the legal service organizations, Centre for Applied Legal Studies, urged me to apply. And I did apply, and I wasn't amongst the 10 shortlisted. At that point, President Mandela had appointed president of the court and 4 judges within his power, which the interim constitution gave him. But another 6 had to be appointed. And the JSC sent 10 names to President Mandela, so I was not amongst them. And then 3 years later, the president of the court, Arthur Chaskelson, asked me to apply again when the obvious appointment was Justice Zakia Kood to succeed Ismail Mohammed, who'd gone to head the Supreme Court of Appeal. And then the third time I applied, and my friend Gilbert Marcus often likes to point out how often I applied before becoming a judge. So it was at the back of my mind, but it was improbable always. And I feel very lucky lucky in the sense of grace and good fortune. That the last time I applied, which was in 2008, there was an interim president arranged for and on behalf of the Zuma presidency, who was President Clement Mplante. I'm very proud that he appointed me. So that was also a good luck stroke, because the Zuma presidency, which took over in May 2009, had a very different approach to appointing, and I might not have made it. So I feel good fortune smiled at me, and I feel very, very privileged by that good fortune.
Oh, well, I think it's very inspiring, Judge, and I for one am very, very glad that I'm sure many are the same as I am, very glad that you were appointed and grateful for everything that you did in your time at the court. So just one final question. What advice do you have for young people who care about the future of South Africa's democracy?
My advice to young people is that to sit back and to be angry and cynical is an option, but it's not a constructive, self-enhancing or self-fulfilling. It doesn't offer enhancement or fulfillment to one's life. Why? Because you have powers as a young person. You have powers, whatever your professional training, whatever your capacities, whatever your situation in life, resource poor or resource rich, you have the power of agency. The Treatment Action Campaign succeeded because of the energy and determination of township activists, township and rural activists who insisted that government should provide them with antiretroviral treatment. And I would say you have agency, you have determination. You must own this democracy. It's your democracy, it's not mine. I've had my chance. My generation has had its chance. Take it over. It's yours, with a framework that enables you to create a society that in these last 30 years we have not yet created, but that you can still create.
Oh, well, thank you, Judge. That's very inspiring. A great way to start the week. So thank you for that. That is the end of our interview. Thank you so much for your time, your valuable time, and your even more valuable wisdom and insights. Muma, unless you have any questions or concerns, I think we can wrap it up there.
No, that was perfect. Once again, thank you so much, Judge. I feel honored to have been a part of this. So thank you so much, Lauren, for the opportunity. And yeah, I feel inspired as well. And I think very insightful. So yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Judge.
Lauren, thank you.
We'll keep you posted, Judge, on when it's going to be published and how it progresses. But you've given us such incredible material here, and I'm really, really excited that we get to make this publicly available to other people. So thank you.
Lovely to work with you.